The autumn rain in western Oregon did not fall in dramatic sheets. Instead, it hung in the air as a persistent, bone-chilling mist that blurred the towering Douglas firs into ghostly silhouettes along the interstate. Inside the pristine cabin of the BMW 5 Series, the atmosphere was just as suffocating, though far more sterile. Julian Vance drove with the practiced, aggressive precision of a man who viewed Portland's highways not as public infrastructure, but as a personal grid to be conquered. His manicured hands gripped the leather steering wheel, his eyes occasionally darting to the digital clock on the dashboard. 10 days. It had been exactly 10 days since Clara's mother, Margaret, had drawn her last breath. 10 days since Clara had stepped out of the hospice wing, hollowed out by 4 years of meticulous, exhausting caregiving. Yet, to Julian, 10 days was apparently the maximum allowable window for grief before it crossed the line into financial inconvenience. "Turn that down, please, Julian. My head is splitting," Clara murmured, her voice barely carrying over the swelling crescendo of Vivaldi's Winter blaring from the surround sound speakers. Julian didn't lower the volume. Instead, he reached over and tapped the dial up a single notch, a small, passive-aggressive display of dominance disguised as absorption in the music. "It's high-fidelity audio, Clara. It clears the mind. And frankly, we need clear minds for this meeting. Richard Lawson doesn't bill by the hour just so we can sit in his conference room and sigh." Clara leaned her forehead against the cool passenger window, watching the rain beads streak backward. She didn't argue. For the past 4 years, her entire existence had been reduced to a series of shifts at the county hospital where she managed medical records, and shifts at her mother's bedside, logging medication dosages, tracking chemotherapy cycles, and translating complex insurance jargon into actionable steps. She was a woman built on systems, order, and quiet endurance. But at home, under Julian's roof, she had gradually become something else, a ghost, an invisible fixture that cooked, cleaned, and managed the domestic debris, while Julian built his empire as a high-end commercial real estate broker. Julian glanced sideways at her, his eyes sweeping over her frame with a look of distinct disapproval. "Is that what you're wearing to a legal proceeding?" Clara looked down at her lap. She was wearing a simple, matte, black A-line dress she had purchased off the rack from Target 3 years ago for a coworker's funeral. It was clean, modest, and pressed, but to Julian, who wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit and a Rolex that caught the dim gray Oregon light, it was an embarrassment. "It's respectful," Clara said softly. "It's outdated, Clara. It looks cheap," Julian retorted, his voice dripping with that smooth, calculated condescension he used to erode her confidence over the years. "You're representing the Vance name today. First impressions matter, even with family attorneys. But I suppose after years of hiding away in hospital corridors and staring at medical charts, your sense of standards has deteriorated." The sting of his words was familiar, a form of emotional isolation, a steady, freezing cold violence that Julian had mastered by constantly reminding her of her low-level administrative salary and her lack of sophistication. He had successfully siloed her off from every major financial decision in their marriage. He had made her believe she was lucky to have him, lucky that a man of his ambition tolerated a woman who smelled of sterile hospital soap and spent her weekends pureeing food for an ailing parent. "I was focused on taking care of Mom. Julian," she whispered, her throat tightening. "I didn't have time to shop for designer morning clothes. And look where that absolute focus got us," Julian said, his knuckles whitening on the steering wheel as he turned the BMW off the highway and into the affluent commercial district where the law offices were located. 4 years of your career stalled out. 4 years of missed networking opportunities for my business because you were always too tired or too busy playing Florence Nightingale. I've carried the financial weight of this household. Clara, I've accommodated your family's crisis at the expense of my own upward mobility. He wasn't mourning Margaret. He hadn't shed a single tear at the service. As the BMW glided into the underground parking garage of the sleek, glass-fronted office complex, Julian's posture shifted. He adjusted his silk tie in the rearview mirror, his expression morphing from irritation to a predatory, hungry anticipation. Clara watched him, a sudden, sharp clarity piercing through the fog of her exhaustion. He wasn't rushing to this meeting to help wrap up her mother's affairs. He was salivating. Rumors of Margaret's $4.2 million estate, compiled from decades of conservative investments and valuable commercial land holdings, had been circulating among the extended family for months. To Julian, this wasn't a room full of grieving relatives. It was the closing table of the biggest deal of his life. "Let me do the talking in there," Julian commanded as he shut off the engine, the sudden silence in the car feeling heavier than the music. Lawson is old school. He respects authority. And frankly, you're too fragile right now to handle the logistics. Let's just get the paperwork signed so we can finally start moving these assets into something that actually generates a return. Clara sat motionless as Julian stepped out of the car, his door shutting with a heavy, expensive thud through the tinted windshield. She saw her own reflection in the vanity mirror, pale, tired, draped in cheap Target black. For years, she had accepted this invisibility as the price of peace. But as she gripped her purse, her fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound notebook containing 4 years of her mother's handwritten dictations and legal reminders. She closed her eyes, took a slow, deep breath of the damp garage air, and opened the car door. The invisible wife was about to step into the light. The elevator ride to the 4th floor was silent, save for the hum of the machinery and the soft click of Julian's leather Oxfords adjusting his stance. When the doors slid open, they stepped into a reception area that epitomized old money Pacific Northwest, polished walnut panels, plush hunter green carpets, and expansive floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the rain-swept skyline of downtown Portland. Waiting for them in the sunlit conference room was a familiar gallery of faces. Clara's aunts, uncles, and a handful of distant cousins were scattered around a massive mahogany table. Sitting near the head of the table was her younger sister, Evelyn. Evelyn looked small in her chair, her eyes rimmed with red, her fingers nervously twisting a damp tissue. She looked up as Clara entered, offering a faint, vulnerable smile. But before Clara could cross the room to sit beside her, Julian intercepted. With the practiced charisma of a broker closing a multi-million-dollar deal, Julian stepped forward, his face morphing into an expression of solemn, commanding authority. He didn't wait for attorney Richard Lawson to take his seat at the head of the table. Instead, Julian stood at the apex of the room, unbuttoning his charcoal suit jacket and effectively commanding the attention of every grieving relative. "Everyone, if I could have your attention for just a moment before we begin," Julian announced, his voice carrying an easy, unshakable confidence that immediately quieted the room. He unzipped his leather briefcase with a sharp, deliberate motion and withdrew a stapled, slightly yellowed document, slamming it onto the mahogany table with an authoritative thud. "Before we get bogged down in bureaucratic legalities, I think it's best we establish a clear roadmap. I have here a copy of Mother Margaret's will, executed 15 years ago." A murmur rippled through the room. Evelyn blinked in confusion, looking from Julian to the document. "As many of you know," Julian continued, pacing slightly, "this will explicitly dictates that the management and execution of the estate should fall to the eldest child, which by bloodline is Evelyn. However, given the immense logistical pressure of a $4.2 million portfolio, Evelyn and I have already discussed a transition plan. We intend to keep the primary investment portfolio intact for the quarter, but the lake house will be liquidated by the end of the month to free up liquidity. The commercial strip downtown is underperforming, so my firm will handle the off-market sale to maximize your distributions. Clara sat quietly at the far corner of the table, her hands folded neatly over her cheap Target purse. She watched her aunts and uncles nod in approval. One uncle reached over to pat Evelyn's hand, whispering congratulations, while an aunt sighed with relief, murmuring that it was good a competent man was taking charge. Then Julian turned his gaze directly onto Clara. The easy warmth vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, calculating mask of pity designed to alienate her completely. "I know this transition might feel disappointing to some," Julian said, looking around the room to ensure every eye shifted toward his wife. "Let's be completely transparent. Clara spent the last 4 years practically managing Margaret's daily life, handling the hospital runs, the prescriptions, the paperwork. But we have to separate emotional caregiving from financial competence. Clara is a medical records clerk. She handles filing cabinets, not multi-million-dollar asset allocations. And let's be honest." He paused, offering a condescending, humorless smile. "You stayed that close to Margaret's bedside because you expected to be rewarded. You assumed that playing the martyr guaranteed a bigger inheritance." The accusation hung heavily in the air, landing like a physical blow. Clara felt the sudden, icy temperature of the room as her relatives shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her eyes. They looked at her with a mix of pity and suspicion, silently validating Julian's narrative. To them, Julian was the successful, sophisticated savior, and she was just the bitter, low-level clerk who had invested 4 years of domestic labor into a failed gamble. "Julian," Evelyn whispered, her face flushing with deep embarrassment. "Don't say that to her. She took care of Mom when none of us could." Julian raised a dismissive hand toward Evelyn without looking at her, keeping his sharp, mocking eyes locked onto Clara. "I'm just speaking the truth, Evie. Convenience answers won't manage a trust." Clara expected a massive payout for her time, but that's not how estate law works. The responsibility goes to the capable. Clara did not flinch. She did not cry, nor did she raise her voice to defend her character against the man she had shared a bed with for over a decade. Instead, she noticed something that the rest of the room, blinded by Julian's loud certainty, had completely missed. Sitting at the head of the table, attorney Richard Lawson had not opened a single folder. He sat back in his leather chair, his fingers interlaced, his expression entirely unreadable but touched by a faint, almost imperceptible shadow of amusement. In the center of the table rested a thick, navy blue estate binder. Its heavy plastic security seal was perfectly intact, unbroken, and untouched. Julian was building a fortress out of a 15-year-old piece of paper, entirely unaware that the foundation beneath his feet had already turned to dust. Clara looked at Mr. Lawson, and for a fraction of a second, the older attorney met her gaze and gave a microscopic nod. The storm was raging in the glass conference room, but Clara sat perfectly still in the eye of it, waiting for the wind to change. The air inside the glass-walled conference room did not just feel cold. It felt chemically sterile, stripped of any residual human warmth by the sheer force of Julian Vance's unshakable arrogance. He sat back in the heavy, walnut-framed leather chair, his long legs crossed casually at the knee, his posture radiating the smug satisfaction of a man who believed the universe existed solely to execute his personal timeline. His fingers lightly drummed a steady, victorious rhythm against the surface of his luxury watch, the polished metal catching the dull, gray Oregon light filtering through the rain-swept windows. To Julian, the meeting was effectively over. He had marched into the room, laid down his 15-year-old piece of paper, and established his dominion. He had successfully rendered his wife invisible, reduced his sister-in-law to a passive bystander, and mapped out the liquidation of a multi-million-dollar estate before the family attorney had even uncapped his fountain pen. Across the massive mahogany table, the extended family sat in a stunned, submissive silence. Aunts and uncles exchanged quiet, validating nods, completely swept up in the magnetic field of Julian's loud, calculated certainty. They looked at Clara with a mixture of collective pity and mild distaste, the unspoken consensus being that she was a bitter, low-level hospital clerk who had foolishly spent 4 years playing the martyr at her mother's bedside, only to be legally and financially outmaneuvered by her far more sophisticated husband. But that suffocating silence did not last. At the head of the table, Mr. Richard Lawson quietly adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, the small motion drawing the room's ambient focus back to the center of authority. He picked up his heavy black fountain pen, turned his legal pad to a fresh page, and gently tapped the metal nib against the paper. The sharp, rhythmic sound was microscopic, yet it carried the precise weight of a gavel striking a sounding block. "Mr. Vance," Mr. Lawson began, his voice maintaining a terrifyingly calm, low-frequency cadence that effortlessly cut through the lingering theatricality Julian had manufactured. "I must commend you on your enthusiasm, and, of course, on your remarkably thorough independent research into historical estate practices and bloodline privileges. It is rare to see a commercial broker display such a passionate, albeit theatrical, interest in the minutiae of family law." Julian's drumming fingers froze. His smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing into a sharp, defensive squint. "I'm just protecting my family's interests, Richard. I've brought Margaret's signed will. The document explicitly dictates that the management and execution of the assets fall to the eldest child. There is nothing to dispute. And frankly, we are losing valuable market time." "There is everything to dispute, Mr. Vance," Mr. Lawson countered, his voice dropping an octave, radiating the unshakable gravity of a man who had spent 40 years watching arrogant men trip over their own shadows. With a single slow and devastatingly casual flick of his index finger, the older attorney pushed Julian's stapled, 15-year-old will toward the edge of the mahogany table, treating it with no more respect than an expired grocery coupon. "Because the document you so confidently slammed onto my table is, in the eyes of the modern legal system, completely irrelevant. It is nothing more than an expensive, historical scrap of paper." A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the boardroom. Evelyn leaned forward, her jaw dropping as she looked from the attorney to the discarded document. Julian's face flushed a sudden, angry crimson, the veneer of the smooth Portland broker instantly cracking to reveal the volatile controller beneath. He lunged forward, slamming both palms onto the table. "What the hell are you talking about, Lawson? That is a legally binding will drawn up by this very firm, signed and witnessed by Margaret Bennett herself. You cannot simply wish away a dead woman's signature because it doesn't fit your timeline." "It was binding, Mr. Vance," Mr. Lawson corrected, his eyes locking onto Julian's with a piercing, cool authority that made the younger man's outburst look incredibly small. "Until 3 years ago. You see, Margaret Bennett was a woman of profound intelligence. More importantly, she was a woman who despised assumptions. She understood a fundamental truth about human nature. Families do not always fracture out of overt greed. More often than not, they fracture because someone thinks they understand something they never actually bothered to read. She knew that vague phrases like eldest child or head of the household are not legal protections. They are invitations to litigation and resentment." Mr. Lawson shifted his weight, pulling the thick, navy blue estate binder into the absolute center of the table. With a crisp, definitive snap that echoed through the room like a starter pistol, he broke the unbroken plastic security seal. "Therefore, 3 years ago, while you were occupied with your commercial listings and too busy to accompany your mother-in-law to her oncology appointments, Margaret sat in this exact room and established an irrevocable living trust, Mr. Lawson explained, his fingers smoothly turning the heavy color-tabbed pages of the master document. By doing so, she legally moved all $4.2 million of her assets, including the liquid investment portfolios, the Columbia River Lake House, and the downtown commercial strip, entirely out of the probate court system. This trust completely supersedes, nullifies, and erases any prior wills. The language inside this binder is absolute. It names no bloodline hierarchies. It identifies every single beneficiary individually by their full legal name. Julian stood up entirely, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He was breathing heavily, his custom-tailored jacket pulling tight against his chest as he attempted to physically dominate the space. This is a trap. Evelyn is the eldest daughter. Even if she put the money in a trust, Evelyn is the one who should be controlling the distributions, which means my firm handles the liquidation. I am her husband, and I will not allow my wife's birthright to be stolen by a deck of legal cards. You are aggressively confusing two entirely separate legal concepts, Mr. Vance, Mr. Lawson said, his tone remaining ice-cold, completely unfazed by Julian's physical posturing. Ownership and administration are distinct entities under the law. A trust requires a trustee, a fiduciary leader bound by strict, unyielding legal obligations to carry out the written instructions of the deceased exactly as they are printed. A trustee does not own the assets. A trustee cannot alter the percentages based on personal opinion, marital pressure, or market fluctuations. They are the guardians of the dead person's intent, nothing more and nothing less. Julian didn't care about the philosophy of fiduciary duty. He cared about the handle of the knife. He stepped toward the head of the table, extending his hand, his eyes gleaming with a desperate, frantic need to claw his way back into a position of dominance. Give me the binder, Richard. Let me see the administration structure. As a licensed broker and a senior member of this family, I will review the text and determine the execution plan on behalf of my wife. Mr. Lawson did not even lift his eyes to acknowledge Julian's outstretched hand. Instead, the older attorney stood up, picked up the massive, heavy original trust binder, and walked right past Julian. His steps were slow, rhythmic, and heavy with consequence. He walked to the quiet corner of the table, leaned down, and placed the document directly in front of Clara. The trust appoints a sole, independent trustee to manage the entirety of the $4.2 million portfolio, Mr. Lawson announced to the dead silent room. That trustee is Clara Bennett. The room seemed to lose its gravity. Julian froze mid-stride, staring down at the navy blue binder sitting in front of his wife, as if it were a live grenade. His face contorted from rage into a state of absolute, uncomprehending shock. Clara, you've got to be kidding me. Clara is a medical records clerk. She processes hospital paperwork and files insurance claims. She doesn't know the first thing about asset management, corporate tax structures, or commercial real estate. There has been a massive clerical error, and I demand a recount of the filing. There is no error, Julian, Clara said, speaking for the first time since they had entered the building. Her voice was not loud. It carried no anger, no theatrical trembling, and none of the defensive panic that usually characterized their arguments at home. It possessed a cool, crystalline, immovable weight, the voice of a woman who had spent 4 years silently recording life and death data. A woman who knew exactly where the bodies were buried because she had organized the charts. She looked up, her clear eyes meeting Julian's frantic gaze with an absolute neutrality that terrified him. Mom asked me to attend every single financial planning meeting with Mr. Lawson over the last 3 years, Clara continued, her fingers resting lightly on the cool plastic of the binder. While you were out hosting networking dinners and telling everyone how much my mother's illness was costing your business, I was sitting right here. I sat here beside her through the radiation fatigue, through the financial restructuring, learning exactly how she wanted her legacy protected. I didn't mention it to you because Mom asked for privacy. And frankly, Julian, you never bothered to ask me about anything unless it involved dinner or your laundry. Julian's jaw tightened so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. He looked around the room, desperate for an ally, but the aunts and uncles who had been nodding along to his promises minutes ago were now staring intently at their own hands or studiously avoiding his gaze. The tide had turned, and he was being swept out to sea. He lunged forward, leaning across the mahogany table until he was inches from Clara's face, his voice dropping into a vicious, desperate hiss. You manipulated an old, dying woman. Julian spat, his mask of sophistication completely disintegrating. You snuck around behind your own sister's back, whispering in an invalid's ear to rewrite the family history. This is elder abuse. It's undue influence. I will hire the most aggressive litigators in the state of Oregon. We will drag you, this firm, and this entire trust into probate court. We will contest every single comma in that document until it is torn to shreds and the court restores the original will. You think you've won because you have a binder? I have the capital to tie this up in litigation for the next 10 years. Clara, you will spend every dime of that inheritance just trying to defend your betrayal. The room held its breath. Evelyn looked terrified, her eyes wide as she looked at the monstrous version of her brother-in-law that had suddenly broken through the cracks. But Mr. Lawson merely let out a soft, dry laugh that sounded like rustling autumn leaves. He walked back to his chair, sat down, and pulled his legal pad toward him with absolute serenity. He turned to the very last page of the master trust agreement, tapping a specific paragraph that was bolded and heavily underlined in Margaret's own, distinct handwriting. Go right ahead and call your litigators, Mr. Vance, the attorney said, a chilling, absolute calm radiating from his wrinkled face. But before you make that phone call, let me read the final protective measure that Margaret insisted on embedding into the bedrock of this trust. She called it her insurance policy against loud men. This is the no contest clause. The silence that followed was total. Even the persistent patter of the Oregon rain against the window pane seemed to recede into the background. The clause explicitly states, Mr. Lawson read aloud, his voice clear and unwavering, that if any named beneficiary or their legal spouse mounts a formal challenge in a court of law, files a lawsuit, or formally disputes the validity of this trust, its trustee appointment, or its percentage allocations, their share of the estate shall immediately and permanently be revoked. Their distribution will instantly be reduced to exactly $0, and their entire portion will be forfeited and legally transferred to the non-disputing parties. Julian froze. His mouth opened slightly to deliver another threat, but no words came out. The air left his lungs in a quiet, defeated hiss. The grand weapon of his wealth, the threat of endless, expensive litigation designed to break Clara's spirit, had just been transformed into a financial noose. One single lawsuit, one formal complaint filed by his real estate lawyers, and he would legally strip his own household of every single cent of the $4.2 million legacy. He was completely trapped, neutralized not by screams or emotional outbursts, but by the clean, quiet, unassailable power of a mother's foresight and a wife's silent competence. Julian slowly sank back into his chair, his face entirely drained of color, his chest heaving in the quiet room, utterly defeated by the invisible woman sitting across from him. The heavy, reinforced glass door of Richard Lawson's law firm clicked shut behind Clara, sealing the frantic, echoing sounds of Julian's unraveling safely inside the building. Stepping out onto the rain-slicked pavement of downtown Portland, Clara inhaled a jagged, freezing breath. The air smelled sharply of wet asphalt, crushed pine needles, and the metallic tang of an approaching Pacific storm. For the first time in over a decade, she did not immediately duck her head to shrink into her collar and shield herself from the elements. Instead, she stood perfectly still on the sidewalk. She let the cold, persistent mist settle against her flushed cheeks, feeling the microscopic droplets beat against her skin like an absolute baptism. For years, she had carried the suffocating, physical weight of being the invisible wife, the silent ghost who drifted through the sterile corridors of the county hospital and the quiet, meticulously clean rooms of their suburban home, perpetually tiptoeing around Julian's volcanic, unpredictable moods. She had wrapped herself in the heavy, woolen blanket of martyrdom, convinced that enduring his cold violence and verbal degradation was a noble, necessary sacrifice. But as she stood under the vast gray canopy of the Oregon sky, watching the brake lights of passing cars bleed brilliant red into the deep puddles, that heavy blanket fell away entirely. She was not a victim. She was a woman who had simply allowed a man whose soul was as shallow as a rain puddle to dictate her worth. The realization did not arrive with a dramatic clap of thunder. It bloomed quietly in her chest, steady, warm, and undeniable, like a hearth fire being stoked back to life. She was done waiting for permission to exist. She was taking absolute control. The very next morning, Clara returned to Mr. Lawson's office to formally initiate her legal authority. The atmosphere in the conference room was completely different without Julian's suffocating, expensive cologne and manic, aggressive energy polluting the air. The room smelled cleanly of lemon polish, aged parchment, and the rich, dark roast coffee sitting in a porcelain cup by her elbow. Clara sat at the mahogany table, her spine perfectly straight, as she formally assumed her role as the sole, independent trustee of her mother's estate. She did not hesitate, nor did she feel overwhelmed. Her professional background managing medical records had hardwired her to appreciate the sacred, unyielding nature of documentation. She knew firsthand that a misplaced decimal could harm a patient, and a vague legal clause could destroy a family. She executed the trust's distribution with surgical, unapologetic precision, ensuring that the legacy Margaret had built over a lifetime was protected exactly as intended. Clara allocated exactly 60% of the $4.2 million portfolio to herself, ensuring the deed to the family home, the quiet sunlit sanctuary where she had spent 4 grueling years logging medication dosages and sitting by her mother's bedside, was transferred solely into her name. The remaining 40% was designated for her younger sister, Evelyn. However, Clara was keenly, painfully aware that handing a massive, liquid sum to her naive sister while she was still legally tied to Julian's influence was akin to throwing raw meat into a shark tank. Working closely with Mr. Lawson, Clara constructed an impenetrable legal fortress around Evelyn's share. She established a heavily fortified spendthrift subtrust. She dictated the terms with cold, unyielding clarity, the scratch of her fountain pen against the heavy paper sounding like a locking vault. Clara would remain the sole administrator of this subtrust, and Julian Vance was explicitly barred from signing, authorizing, managing, or even viewing the account balances. It was a financial moat that Julian's greed could never, ever cross. With her fiduciary duties secured, Clara turned her meticulous, analytical gaze toward the domestic ruins of her own marriage. She knew Julian better than he knew himself. He was a creature of immense ego, and ego always, inevitably, left a paper trail. Late at night, while Julian was either out networking or sulking furiously in the guest bedroom, Clara transformed the kitchen island into a war room. The house was dead quiet, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the stainless steel refrigerator and the rapid, rhythmic tapping of her fingers against her laptop keyboard. The harsh, pale blue light of the screen illuminated her determined face as she dove into a decade's worth of digital banking archives. Her entire professional life was dedicated to hunting down discrepancies, cross-referencing complex billing codes, and finding the hidden truth buried beneath layers of bureaucratic noise. She applied that exact same ruthless, detached methodology to their joint accounts. For 3 exhausting weeks, fueled by bitter black coffee and the metallic, thrumming adrenaline of impending liberation, she audited her husband. She found exactly what she knew she would find. Julian had been siphoning funds from their shared savings for years to float his failing, off-market commercial ventures. She tracked the hidden wire transfers, the doctored expense reports, and the exorbitant charges from luxury hotels in Seattle, where he had supposedly been attending solo real estate seminars. She printed every single piece of undeniable proof. She bound the documents in a thick black leather portfolio, the heavy, crisp pages smelling of fresh laser ink and absolute, undeniable ruin. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday evening. The autumn rain was drumming a steady, chaotic rhythm against the bay windows of their kitchen, the sound echoing loudly in the tense space. Julian was leaning against the counter, pouring himself a generous glass of expensive, peaty scotch, the heavy ice cubes clinking sharply against the crystal tumbler. He looked exhausted and hollowed out, his face gray, with the compounding stress of realizing that the Bennett family fortune was permanently locked away from his desperate grasp. Clara walked into the kitchen, her footsteps soundless on the polished hardwood floor. She did not scream. She did not cry. She felt no rage, only a profound, chilling emptiness. She simply walked up to the pristine, white marble island and slid a thick manila envelope across the smooth surface. It glided silently, stopping right next to his scotch glass. "What is this?" Julian muttered, his voice raspy, not even bothering to look up at her. "A way out," Clara replied, her voice as cool, hard, and smooth as the marble beneath her hands. Julian set his glass down and opened the envelope. Inside were the formal divorce papers, sitting heavily on top of the black leather portfolio containing his complete financial autopsy. As he flipped open the leather cover, Clara watched the exact moment his towering arrogance finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She watched his pupils dilate, his eyes tracking frantically over the meticulously highlighted bank statements, the hidden accounts, and the undeniable proof of his financial infidelity. The silence in the kitchen grew so heavy and absolute that it felt difficult to pull air into her lungs. The rich smell of the scotch suddenly seemed acrid and sickening. Julian looked up at her, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish pulled from the water. He knew with terrifying certainty that if she took this portfolio to a judge, or worse, to the senior partners at his luxury brokerage firm, he would not only be financially devastated, but professionally blacklisted across the entire Pacific Northwest. "Clara," his voice cracked, a pathetic, reedy sound entirely devoid of its usual smooth, commanding baritone. "You will sign the settlement entirely out of court," Clara instructed, her tone devoid of malice, anger, or residual love. It was the detached, clinical tone of a surgeon declaring a time of death. "You will leave this house tonight. You will take only what you brought into this marriage, and you will never attempt to contact my sister or me again. If you try to fight me, if you try to drag this out, I will bury you under so much paperwork you won't see daylight for a decade." Julian signed the papers with a violently trembling hand. The harsh, frantic scratch of his pen against the paper was the sweetest, most liberating sound Clara had ever heard. The morning after Julian packed his designer luggage and drove his BMW out of her driveway for the very last time, Clara woke up to a house that felt incredibly vast, light, and profoundly peaceful. The oppressive, cold tension that had haunted the hallways for years was entirely gone. She walked into the master bathroom, the cold ceramic tile bracing against her bare feet, and looked at herself in the mirror. It was time to shed the ghost completely. Her first major investment was in her intellect. She sat at her newly cleared desk, the bright morning sun streaming through the window and warming her skin, and paid the tuition to enroll in an intensive, accelerated online financial management certification program at Boston University. The sharp, decisive click of her mouse, confirming the payment, felt like a heavy iron chain snapping in half. She was taking her innate, quiet talent for organization and weaponizing it with formal, high-level financial literacy. Next, she addressed her physical armor. She drove into downtown Portland and walked into a high-end, minimalist salon surrounded by the soothing, earthy scent of expensive botanical oils and the low, constant hum of blow dryers. She told the stylist to cut off the long, exhausted, faded hair that she had tied back in a messy, practical bun for the last 4 years of caregiving. The stylist's shears snipped away inches of dead weight, the sound crisp and definitive near her ears, leaving Clara with a sleek, sharp, jaw-length bob that framed her cheekbones with undeniable, modern authority. She drove to a boutique and threw away the cheap, shapeless, outdated clothes that Julian had constantly criticized. She replaced them with structured wool coats in camel and navy, flawlessly tailored blazers, and crisp silk blouses that felt smooth, luxurious, and powerful against her skin. When she walked down the street afterward, she no longer drifted like a shadow. Her leather heels clicked against the pavement with a rhythmic, grounded, and terrifying purpose. But Clara's profound transformation could not be considered complete while her younger sister remained in the dark, still partially blinded by Julian's lingering manipulations. A week later, Clara invited Evelyn to a quiet, tucked-away cafe in the Pearl District. The shop was incredibly warm, smelling intensely of roasting coffee beans, melting butter, and sweet cinnamon. Rain continued to wash the gray streets outside, but inside, sitting in a cozy, tufted leather booth, the atmosphere was a protected sanctuary. Evelyn arrived looking incredibly nervous, her eyes darting around the cafe as if she expected Julian to materialize from the shadows to dictate her order. Clara reached across the small, wooden table and took Evelyn's cold, trembling hands in her own warm, steady ones. "He's gone, Evie," Clara said softly, her eyes holding her sister's gaze. "The divorce is finalized. He is out of our lives completely." Evelyn exhaled a shaky, fragmented breath, but the deep-seated confusion remained in her eyes. "Why did he do this, Clara?" "He told me you were trying to steal everything. He told me you manipulated Mom behind our backs." Instead of arguing or raising her voice to defend herself, Clara calmly opened her leather briefcase. The rich, earthy smell of the tanned leather wafted up as she pulled out a secondary, carefully curated file. She didn't show Evelyn the painful, humiliating details of her ruined marriage. Instead, she showed her sister the objective, undeniable financial documents regarding Julian's actual plans for Evelyn's inheritance. Clara walked Evelyn through the highlighted texts, her manicured finger tracing the hidden, predatory clauses Julian had attempted to draft before the trust was revealed, clauses that would have granted him total, unfettered access to Evelyn's name, credit score, and liquid assets. "He wasn't trying to protect you, Evie," Clara murmured, her voice thick with fierce, protective love. "He was setting you up to be the collateral damage for his own failing investments. I locked your inheritance in the subtrust not to control you, but to build a concrete wall he couldn't climb over. It's your money, Evelyn. It always will be. But I had to make sure he couldn't use it to destroy your future." Evelyn stared at the printed numbers, the stark black ink cutting cleanly through years of Julian's smooth, gaslighting lies. The grand illusion of the successful, caring brother-in-law evaporated into thin air, leaving behind the cold, ugly reality of a predator. Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes, spilling over her dark lashes and dropping silently onto the cafe table. She let out a ragged, breathless sob, collapsing forward. Clara immediately slid out of her seat and moved to her sister's side of the booth, wrapping her arms tightly and fiercely around her. The physical warmth of the embrace, the sweet smell of Evelyn's floral shampoo, and the sound of her quiet crying marked the definitive end of a decade-long emotional winter. They held onto each other as the rain poured down outside. The manufactured rivalry and the toxic manipulation washed away completely, leaving behind a fierce, unbreakable sisterhood forged in the absolute, uncompromising power of the truth. The late afternoon sun hung low over the rolling hills of the Willamette Valley, casting a brilliant, warm amber glow across the cemetery grounds. It was the peak of autumn, the exact time of day photographers referred to as the golden hour. A gentle breeze swept through the hillside, sending a flurry of crimson and gold maple leaves dancing across the well-manicured grass and settling softly around the polished granite headstones. The air carried the crisp, clean scent of damp earth and pine, characteristic of a peaceful Oregon twilight. Clara stood before her mother's resting place, her posture upright, her shoulders relaxed and unburdened. She was no longer enveloped in the bleak, shapeless mourning garments that had once hidden her away from the world. Today, she wore a beautifully tailored camel-colored wool coat that accentuated her sharp, modern haircut, her eyes reflecting the warm evening light with absolute clarity. There was no sorrow left in her gaze, nor was there the suffocating exhaustion that had defined the final years of her caregiving journey. A light step sounded on the grass beside her. Clara turned to see Evelyn walking up the slope, her face bright and full of life. Evelyn was dressed in a sleek, professional emerald trench coat, carrying a small leather briefcase. She smiled warmly at Clara, wrapping her arm tightly around her sister's waist. "Sorry I'm late," Evelyn whispered, leaning her head against Clara's shoulder. "The bank took longer than expected, but it's done. The new business account is officially active." Clara squeezed her sister back, a profound sense of pride swelling in her chest. Over the past few months, Evelyn had undergone a remarkable transformation of her own. Stripped of Julian's toxic influence, she had actively taken charge of her life, securing an independent position at a local design firm and learning to manage her own finances with a sharp, newfound maturity. She was no longer the naive puppet Julian had tried to manipulate. She was a self-reliant woman stepping boldly into her own future. As for Julian, his absence from their lives was absolute. The exposure of his financial misconduct and the messy, undeniable details of the divorce settlement had completely shattered his carefully constructed reputation in the Portland real estate market. The high-end developers and wealthy clients he had spent his life trying to impress had quietly cut ties, leaving his business in ruins. He had vanished from the suburban social circles entirely, forced to relocate out of state to escape the shadow of his own undoing. Yet, standing here in the golden light, Clara realized she felt no anger toward him. The bitter resentment that had threatened to consume her during the darkest days of her marriage had completely evaporated. Julian was no longer a source of pain. He was simply a closed chapter, a necessary catalyst that had forced her to discover her own strength. Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a fresh bouquet of white dahlias, her mother's favorite flower. She knelt down and placed them gently at the base of the headstone, her fingers lightly tracing the engraved letters of Margaret's name. "We did it, Mom," Clara whispered, her voice steady and peaceful. Looking up at the vast, clear Oregon sky, Clara smiled through a few stray tears of pure gratitude. She understood now that her mother's greatest gift hadn't been the $4.2 million estate, nor was it the physical properties they had inherited. The true diadem of Margaret's legacy was the absolute clarity she had left behind, a clarity that had acted as a shield, protecting her family from the loudest lie in the room and forcing her daughters to wake up to their own potential. Clara stood up, taking Evelyn's hand in hers. They turned away from the grave, walking down the hillside together toward the horizon. The truth had never needed to raise its voice to be heard. It had simply waited for them to be ready. Free, proud, and entirely whole, Clara Bennett walked forward into the golden hour of her new life, completely master of her own destiny. All shadows must fade before the truth, and every pain is simply the start of a beautiful rebirth. Always remember, the right to write a new chapter of your life is forever in your hands. Please like, share, and subscribe if this story resonated with you. And I will see you on the next page.